Hi, everybody. I'm Leah Hines. I'm Executive Director of the Charleston Conference, and I would like to welcome everyone to our kickoff webinar for the ATG Trendspotting project. We're really glad that all of you are here with us today. I am being joined by two amazing women that I respect very much, and I'm glad that they're here. Katina Strauch is the founder of the Charleston Conference and editor of Against the Grain. Many of you know her from past conferences, and she's a rock star in the library world. Lisa Henschliff is professor and coordinator for information literacy services at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thanks to both of you. Hi, Katina. Hi, Lisa.
Thank you very much.
While people are joining, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
While people are joining and getting set up with the audio, if you would take just a minute and say your name and where you're from in the attendee chat, just to introduce yourself so we'll know who's joining us here today. It's good to see so many of you here. So just say your name and where you're from. Also, throughout the presentation, when Lisa's giving the talk later on, if you have questions, hi, Jim O'Donnell from ASU. Hi, Audrey. Hi, Gwen. Hi, Lisa. There's a green icon with a question mark that says ask the presenter a question. So sometimes if the attendee chat starts moving really quickly, it's hard to keep track of questions and comments, but this way we'll be able to address the Q&A at the end of the presentation if you have something that needs to be addressed. Hi, Todd Carpenter. Hi, Russell Zach. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We have a couple of quick polls just to get a little bit more information about the attendees. So what type of attendee are you? Librarian, publisher, vendor, student? And if you select the other, let us know what it is in the chat box. Just tell us what the other category might be. 71% librarians so far, a few publishers, a few vendors. Hi, Nettie, Standards Organization. Hi, Todd. All right. 74% librarian, 9% publisher, 9% vendor, 9% other. All right, so let's see here. What is your, let me see, close this one. So the next poll is what is your role within your company? Collection, tech services staff, administrator, director, manager, public services or customer services, sales, marketing, advertising, communication staff, or other. And again, please let us know what the other might be in the attendee chat. It's a nice mix there. Discovery relationships at OUP, very cool. Systems librarian. Okay, so it looks like about 29% collection or tech services staff, 40% is still moving a little bit. Administrator, director, manager, 11% public services or customer services, 11% sales, marketing, advertising, communications, 8% other. All right, well, thank you very much for sharing. And that's all I have for the introduction part. I'm going to turn this over to Katina to talk about a little bit of background and the vision of ATG Trendspotting.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being at this webinar. We at Against the Grain have always wanted to assure a unified look at what's going on with scholarly publishing and libraries. In fact, some of us convened at the Mills House Hotel as early as the 1980s, and as recently as last year in our FuturesLab discussion, we had a discussion led by Heather Staines and Mark Sandler. This has never seemed more important than now when all of us are under new competitive forces. Although we've always been respected and supported, we have to be more proactive and aggressive than we have been in the past. Obviously, none of us can predict the future, and there are many trends pulling us all in many different directions. Lisa Henschliff has agreed to be our project director of Trendspotting. Thanks, Lisa, for all your initiative, organization, energy, etc. A special thanks to some people who have shared and continue to share their insights. Leah Hines, Pat Sabosic, Don Hawkins, Don Gilson, John Lavender, and many, many others. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Lisa has to tell us. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Katina. So it's very exciting to be part of this ATG trend spotting. And I hope that as I'm giving an introduction to this, I'll be watching the attendee chat out of the corner of my eye. And Leah's also promised to help me out if you have questions as we're going through. As was mentioned, I'm an information literacy coordinator in my day job. And so I do a lot of teaching. And so one of my principles is there's no point in moving on if the people who you're speaking with aren't coming with you. So stop me if something isn't clear, let's clarify it and move on together. So the goal of our ATG Trendspotting Initiative is to establish an ongoing process for identifying those trends that might be social, policy, economic, technology, or educational that are impacting on the information industry. And to do what is called forecasting, which is different than predicting. When we predict the future, we make a particular statement about what will happen when. With forecasting, we explore what is possible that could happen, what is likely to happen, and what is the possible impact. And then, of course, we also ask ourselves the question, would we like that? And if we don't like it, how could we disrupt that? And if we can't disrupt it, how can we mitigate the impact? So it's a very multifaceted discussion that is about looking at multiple possible futures and not about predicting a particular point in the future. In this particular case, we want to look at the impact on scholarly communication, publishing, and academic libraries. That is the scope of our impact in the sense of what we're forecasting onto. But the trends are outside of that. They're the things that are pushing on and pushing into that environment of the information industry. So of course, there are trends that we can say are happening within our industry, but what we're trying to do is step back from that and say, what are the larger forces, the forces outside the industry that are pushing in on us? So what do we mean by an ongoing process? Well, one of the things that we realized is for this to be an ongoing process, it had to be community engaged. And by community engaged, if you say you're part of the community of the information industry and people who care about the trends that are pushing on us and the ways that our various aspects are reacting, you are part of the community. So this comes out of the theory of community of practice, which is one of my favorite theories, but I won't bore you with all the details about that today. You can corner me anytime though, and I have a 1 minute, 2 minute, and 3 week talk I can give you about that because it's one of my favorite concepts. But this idea that we'll collectively work together in order to look at these ideas, and we'll work cooperatively and collaboratively across our silos within our various professions to explore these trends and forecast the impacts. So what will you see happen as a result? Sort of what are the deliverables? How will we know when we're being successful? So the first success will be that we actually get through this entire process and that we see all of these deliverables. Now you'll see that I've had a little bit of fun in naming these. I hope that it'll bring you a little bit of joy. If nothing else, you can laugh at me for trying to come up with some names that would be a little bit memorable. But we're right now in the process of trend spotting, in our process of trend storming. Which is to come up with a list of those trends that we're going to focus on for this year. And Michelle, you're absolutely correct. For people who are familiar with the PESTLE format, there is absolutely a lot of sort of connection with that. I get a little nervous about calling it PEST because that sounds a little negative, but I know PESTLE is a little bit broader. But there are a lot of different forecasting trend models out there, and sort of we've adapted from there to kind of respond to what seems to be the priorities in our community. So in our case, we're looking at social, political, economic, technology, and education. And I'm just looking at that and thinking, okay, that acronym SPEET, I don't know. We'll have to maybe reorganize those in order to come up with, it could be PEETs, it could be TEPs. We'll have to see about that. But our own trend storm. So we're brainstorming and we're asking you to fill out our trend storm form, which is a simple form where you can describe for us the trend that you see in the social, political, economic, technology, and educational landscape, and to discuss what you currently see as the impact of that trend. Our expert panel will be working with those nominated trends to select those that we'll have as our focus when we meet together at the Charleston Conference at the Trend Lab. The Trend Lab, ooh, steep, I like that. I think I'm going with steep. The Trend Lab at the Charleston Conference will be an invitational event on Monday. And so on that form, you also have an opportunity to say that yes, you'll be at the Charleston Conference and you would be interested in an invite to this Monday session. But even if you're not going to be there, we still want you to participate in the trend storming with us. On that Monday for 2 hours, we will be having a discussion that is structured to look at the impact of those trends on the information industry with a small group of those nominated and invited. So please put yourself forward, because we're looking for the group of people that joins together on that Monday to cross all sectors of the information industry: publishers, technologists, platforms, standard setters, hi Todd and Nettie, as well as librarians, of course. Our Trend Lab will happen on Monday before the conference officially kicks off. But everyone at the conference will have an opportunity to attend our Trend Talk panel, where we will share the results of the Trend Lab and have a broader discussion based on what that meeting was able to distill on Monday. We're still scheduling that Trend Talk panel in concert with the Conference Program Planning Committee, but we'll be looking to have that probably on no earlier than Wednesday, maybe preferably on Thursday, so that I get just a little bit of time between Monday and giving the talk on the Trend Talk. And we'll be asking a couple of our people who participate in the Trend Lab to be part of our Trend Talk panel. Then, for those people who are not at the Charleston Conference, of course, we'll have a recording of the panel that is at the Charleston Conference for people to participate in. But we'll also be publishing a set of short essays that summarize those trends and look at the forecasting on them, synthesizing the discussion at the conference and really assessing the speed, depth, and desirability of the coming changes. And we're calling those our trend texts. And we'll be seeking volunteers / nominators / people that I can corral and convince that they want to write a trend text. Now, just before you get very nervous about, those will probably be like 5 to 6 pages long. So not that long, just slightly longer than your average blog post. Then, of course, we'll start this again in the spring 2019 with a trend spotting webinar, sharing the summary of the process across our trend texts and kicking off the next round of trend identification. Now, you might be thinking, well, this webinar this year is being held in June. That's not spring. Nope. In 2018, 2019, we're on a little bit of an accelerated time frame. In 2019, 2020, we'll have a little bit more leeway in this, but I'm still confident that we'll be able to get it done. So these are the outputs that you'll see: a vetted list, a Trend Lab discussion, a Trend Talk panel, a set of published trend texts, and then, of course, the webinar next spring. Now, who's going to be doing all this work? Well, Katina already mentioned that she's asked me to be the project director, and I've agreed to do that, and I'm very excited about this opportunity. But I'll be working with the leadership group of Lisa, Katina, Leah, who you've all met today, as well as Tom Hines. In addition, we've invited a number of people to join our expert panel, which will be the members of the leadership group, plus Mark Sandler and Heather Staines, who led the FuturesLab discussion last year at the Charleston Conference, as well as 2 or 3 others. Our expert panel will be particularly joining us in helping us move from the brainstorm trend storm into identifying those trends that we discuss at the Trend Lab and helping to focus that discussion. I'm also hoping that they're going to help me when we get to the trend texts and possibly reviewing some of those texts and giving feedback to our authors. But none of them have quite agreed to that yet. Heather, Mark, you know where I'm coming for you next. Now, of course, participants, that's you. Anyone who would like to participate in this process is welcome to send in a trend storm, to nominate yourself to participate in the Trend Lab, to listen to that trend talk, and of course, to be a reader and engager with our trend texts. And then we hope to see you at a webinar again next year at this time or a little bit earlier. I've mentioned a number of times that we have the trend storming process going on right now. The deadline for filling that out is July 20th, and I believe that Leah has already put that URL into the chat as well, so you can click through. I want to point out that if you click into that and start filling it out and then want to think about it a little bit, you can save your work and come back to it at a later point in time. It's a great thing about the Illinois survey software that we were able to use. It has this save my place and come back and do the rest of my work. Let's talk just a little bit more about what the Trend Lab will be at the Charleston Conference. I already mentioned that it'll be an invitational meeting based on nominations that we'll receive through our trend storming. At the Trend Lab, we'll hear lightning talk presentations of the trends. So we'll be asking some of the people who nominated trends to give us a short presentation about what that trend is and ask us questions about possible implications. We'll then have small group discussions of the implications of those trends. What are the best and worst case outcomes for each of those trends? It's often very easy to be both Pollyannish as well as really negative. And so we're going to be looking for both best case and worst case scenarios, as well as likelihood. We'll then have a discussion across all of the trends, looking at the themes, the convergences, the divergences, and various ways that we can think about these things. We'll also be looking at these from the lenses of a variety of different perspectives. What does this mean for content creation, for publishing, for use, for access, for reuse, for licensing, for purchasing, for preservation? There's so many different lenses that we can take on these topics. So there'll be a lot of moving parts, but I think it'll be a very dynamic 2 hours of discussion that will bring us to being able to share with the community at large some of the robustness of the ways that our industry is being affected by the trends that are out in the world. Then we'll have our Trend Talk, that panel at the Charleston Conference, which will report out from the Trend Lab. And also we'll try and host some discussions of the implications of the trends. Again, the best worst case outcomes, and hopefully have a slightly broader discussion based on sort of the ability to have a little bit more engagement with the broader community of people attending the Charleston Conference. Again, we'll look at a discussion of themes, divergences, and we'll be looking at these across this in 1, 3, and 5-year horizons, following the best practices according to a number of the forecasting experts in the Association of Professional Futurists. There's an association for everything. What will these trend texts look like? There'll be a set of short essays. Each will summarize the trends, forecast the impact, synthesize the discussion, and assess the speed, depth, and desirability of the coming changes. And of course, we'll also have the opportunity to think about what would it be like if we wanted to try and accelerate one of the trends and the impact that it's having? What if we want to try and mitigate against that impact? There are different ways we can respond to the trends and the forecast that we see. Some of it might be trying to accelerate things. Others might be trying to slow it down or divert it or change the way we're responding to it. Now, I've used this word, I don't know how many times, the word trend. So what exactly is a trend? And we're going with steep, I think. So what's a steep? A steep trend. A trend is a tendency or a direction of change over time. So it's looking at change. So a trend is not just a fact, but it is a fact that is changing. And a trend can be increasing or decreasing. Something could be happening more or less. A trend can also be strong in the sense that it's just full speed ahead, or it can be weak, something that appears to be happening, but maybe slows down, maybe speeds up. And of course, it can be accelerating or slowing, as I just mentioned. Here's a definition from an article that I think does a nice job. It's a lot of words on one slide. But one of the things I really liked about this is this discussion that basically we all experience the trend. And often they create these like broad shifts over a period of several years, and they're often global. So it's really complex to try and put your arms around a trend in some ways. But what's also, I think, really good observation in this quote is that for most people, you can't change the trend. You can react to it or respond to it. But as individuals, the global nature of some of these things makes it very difficult for any individual actor to change the trend. Collectively, however, you can have an impact on a trend. So there's some interesting dynamics that we can already start to think about in our own industry about where individual and collective action can and cannot have the impact that we might want it to have. So I thought I'd put a couple trends on the screen just to help us get our head around what kind of trends we're looking at. Here's an example. Brian Alexander is a futurist in our own space, primarily in higher education and in education more generally, and he tends to look more at technology within higher education. But one of the things that he has sort of been putting out is his writing on what he calls peak higher education. In other words, in the United States, we have as the most institutions of higher education that we will ever have. And he is predicting merge, collapse, closure at the number of institutions. He points out, and part of his reason for saying that forecast is this trend. The number of people enrolled in American higher education declined again in fall of 2017. And that number has been declining steadily for the past 6 years. So prior to that past 6 years, enrollment in higher education in the United States was growing, but in raw numbers now, it is declining. Something to think about. So then we would ask ourselves, so what is the impact of that on the information industry? Is it a strong impact? It is a weak impact? How is this going to affect academic libraries, publishing, etc.? We can immediately see, obviously, that the fewer people enrolled in higher education is probably going to impact the textbook sales because you have fewer people buying textbooks when you have fewer people taking classes. Now, what we'd want to check, of course, is whether there are course enrollments, because numbers of people in higher ed and course enrollments are not equal. So fewer people could be taking more classes, more people could be taking fewer classes. So this is where we have to explore things a little bit. Here's another example. This one is actually somebody writing from the perspective of the UK. So that's where you see this Edelman's research. But I think what's said here is also true of the United States and a lot of other countries, which is that we have seen a collapse of trust in institutions. And in particularly, this lack of trust has hit civil society institutions directly and changed the context in which they operate. And so then they ask the question, will people continue to lose faith in everything from business to the media to the state? How can civil society rebuild trust in itself and help transform other institutions to make them trustworthy? So if there is a collapse of trust in institutions, and libraries, universities, publishers, standard setters are all organizations that historically have enjoyed rather high levels of trust. What does the collapse of trust mean for our industry? Does it mean that we need to put more effort towards explaining and justifying and defending our credibility? And does it have a differential impact? And here is an example. I can say that at the moment, it appears that libraries are maintaining the trust that the public has had in them. Whether that will continue, that's a good question for us to ask. But particularly for those who are in the business of producing publications, we certainly know that the news publications have had a collapse of trust. Is the same thing happening to our scholarly publications? What would happen if it did happen? What would we need to do in order to respond to that? Now, one thing we can say is that a collapse of trust is that's the trend, right? So it could be that there are some positives that come out of the collapse of trust. It could be that we can't rest on our laurels and we have to really take a hard look at ourselves, and that could strengthen us in the long term, even if it's painful in the short term. So this is why we also want to look at best case and worst case kinds of things. Okay, one more trend. Here's a trend that comes from EDUCAUSE, which probably many of you are familiar with. that points out that there's a major trend towards analytics technologies. That today, almost any interaction you have online is being tracked, stored, analyzed, and used. And this has the notion of big data, massive amounts of data reflecting behavior and actions of populations and subpopulations. And we can now compute across that. So we can look for trends, patterns that historically maybe we wouldn't have noticed because we wouldn't have had any way of tracking on it. Now, I think it doesn't take very long for us to think of a lot of ways that analytics technologies might be impacting on our industry. We can track use that we've never been able to see before. Potentially, we might be able to also see things that are underutilized and market them in new ways. Perhaps we can also see piracy in ways that we haven't seen before because these things are being tracked. There's obviously implications for privacy, but also for service design and development. So this is one that I sure hope somebody's going to put into our trend storm. So some trends are a little easier to see how they might immediately have an impact on our industry. Others might be sort of indirect. So enrollment declining might not have that immediate direct impact on the information industry in the way that analytics technologies might. But this is part of what we'll figure out through trend storming, our expert panel reviewing what trends we're going to talk about, and then the deep dive that we do during the Trend Lab at the Charleston Conference. So here's the key questions that we'll be asking ourselves across this trend storm and the Trend Lab. What is the trend that we're having a discussion about? Is it a social, policy, economic, technology, or educational trend? Or does it cut across a number of those different areas? What is the potential impact on scholarly communication, publishing, and/or academic libraries? How fast would that impact? How fast do we see that impact coming? How deep or transformative would that be? Would it totally change things? Or would it just sort of be something we had to cope with? And then, is it desirable? Big change could be hugely desirable. Big change could be not so desirable. Small change could be not desirable because maybe it's not enough change. Maybe we want to accelerate that change. So there's a lot of things that we'll be discussing. And then I haven't even mentioned, but of course, these trends are interacting. They push on each other. So if enrollment is declining because we're using analytics to get people to their degrees faster, that might be a good thing. If enrollment is declining because state funding is declining and people can't afford higher education and therefore they're not getting degrees, that might not be so good. So these trends are going to interact with each other, and that's going to be another thing that we have to figure out and talk about. So I think if anything, this discussion here today has probably proven to us that trends are not simple. Forecasting is definitely not simple, but hopefully through this discussion, I've convinced you that it'll be an interesting process and one that you want to engage in. So we're coming to the end of the formal presentation now and have an opportunity for some discussion here together, or questions, comments, anything people might like to ask. So I'm going to take a sip of water as I watch for the chat room here. So you could take questions either about particular trends that you've been thinking about the process generally, or other aspects that you think about with this. Oh, Christine, what a great observation. How do we differentiate between a trend and a fad or a bubble? Trend, which could be a fad, we kind of historically typically know in retrospect, which is a little bit of a challenge. Bubbles can be predicted though sometimes, or forecasted. Let me correct my language there. So a bubble might be the result of a trend, Or it might be that the trend accelerates to a particular point and then it decelerates. So we tend to talk about increase and decreases if there's one, but a trend could also be having sort of like a modular pattern to it. Jill, what a great question. The answer is any and all. Obviously, more information will help us assess and make sure we know what you're talking about, but the only thing the form has is a maximum number of words, not a minimum. So I'm looking for you to state the trend, but then to also do a little bit of reflection about what you think the potential impact would be. But you're not being held to this, like it's a brainstorm at this point. So yeah, don't feel like you need to write me like a whole essay. And to describe the trend, I've given you a maximum of 500 words. And to share your reflection on the trend, I gave you a maximum of 800. I kind of think that most people are going to come in closer to 200 at most, but I didn't want to cut people off who had a lot to say. Yeah, Todd, exactly. Bubbles could have long-term impacts. Joanne, anyone can put in a trend because the trend is looking out into the environment and identifying those forces. So, you know, anyone could be predicting what could be impacting on scholarly publishing, scholarly communication, academic libraries. In fact, I really hope that we'll not just have librarians putting these things in. Our community of practice in the information industry is bigger than just librarians. So Mark, that's a great question. For the impact of the trends, we are focusing on forecasting the impact on scholarly communications, scholarly publishing, and academic libraries. So sort of like, as we consider the trend, that's going to be our context. But the trends themselves could be broader. So for example, I'm making this up, so I have no idea if it's true. But let's say somebody said, oh, an interesting trend is that trade publishers are increasingly moving to market their trade publications as textbooks. Then we'd ask ourselves, well, what's the implications of that for scholarly communication, scholarly publishing, and academic libraries? So scholarly publishers might say, oh, we have competition for authors. Scholarly communication faculty might be saying, oh, maybe I can reach a different audience and maybe I can be rewarded in different ways. Or they might be like, not going there. There's no rewards for publishing to the public. And academic libraries, we might have to look at who we're purchasing from. Now, I just made that up off the top of my head. So that's exactly the kind of brainstorm example, except you'd want it to be like, you'd want to at least know that that trend is true. So Todd, the expert panel will be going through how many ever reams of submissions in order to sort of create a set that we feel is coherent. So we're going to do that for this year, at least with this expert panel model. The people who are invited to the lab will definitely have the list ahead of time, but I don't see any reason why we wouldn't try and publish that out more generally. So let me take that idea and figure out how we could at least maybe get some sort of community feedback on it. I might also say that's a great idea, and we'll hold it for next year when we have a slightly longer time frame. So I'm committing to the idea. I just don't know when we'll be able to implement it. Yeah, I was looking at idea scale, actually. It's a very specific one, and that I know we don't have time to do this year, just in the time frame that we need to work with. But maybe we can do it with a little bit more simple survey or something this year, and then move to a more robust process next year when we've got the full year time frame to work with. I'd also be interested if people have thoughts about how you could imagine using either the brainstorm list or the trend text that will come out in your own organizations. Like, what would make those most useful to you? I realize you just heard about these for the first time, so you might be like, I have no idea. It sounds good. But if you have ideas of how you might want to use those and how they might be structured in a way to make them most usable, I'd really be interested in that as well. As we're sitting here, I'm realizing something I missed from the platform that I teach on, which is in the teaching platform we use. When someone's typing, you can see that they're typing. You can't see what they're typing, but you can see that there's a little icon that there's action. Whereas here, I can't tell if like everyone's typing or everyone's just sitting and waiting. Yeah, definitely this should be useful for strategic planning. Thanks, Jill. I didn't put this slide in the PowerPoint, but we also have a plan to gather feedback and assess the process throughout the year to see how the different parts work. So as you see that opportunity for feedback coming out, I hope you'll take a few minutes each time or occasionally and drop us a line to let us know whether we've structured this in a way that's as useful as it could be, or if we could improve it in some ways. Athena, you're already pushing at something that Katina keeps asking me about. Are there metrics we could start gathering? Which is a great question. And I sort of tried to wrap my head around that, and maybe that can be one of our discussions. Maybe you can even do a webinar next spring, a separate one that's like, so what could we be measuring about this to keep track of it? Great question. Okay. I will hang out here for a little bit longer, but I do want to, let's see, I'm going to put the URL back into the chat just so everyone has it easily accessible. Oh, thanks, Todd. Yeah, we might have to, in the future, we might structure that way. Yeah, actually, that's not a bad idea, Athena, too. Yeah, so one aspect we might add is sort of like, maybe it's positive for the libraries, but negative for the publishers or vice versa. So that's a really good point, is that how this impacts these different aspects might be really different. We also do have a hashtag, ATG Trendspotting. Pretty straightforward, that we'll be monitoring. So at any point, if you have a thought, or maybe you even see somebody else tweet something and you just want to like raise it up, retweet it with ATG Trendspotting, and that'll be another way for it to get to our attention. Audrey, when you say all the communities, do you mean like we've been talking publishers, technologists, libraries, or are you thinking our user communities, like students, faculty, staff? Okay, everything. Great. That's great. So I think already you guys have given me so many ideas of ways that we can grow and improve this over time. So I really appreciate that. And I want to be clear that, you know, if you give an idea and you don't see it implemented this year, just know that it is not only in a chat text here that we'll have. I've been taking notes. Some of these things just with our timelines might not be possible to try this year, and we might need to hold them in abeyance until next year. And we'll also, this is our, you know, it's a collective experiment in many ways. It's a community engaged experiment is another way of saying that, you know, we've designed a process, and just like developing a library service or a new publication series or anything, you design based on best practices, what's in the literature, and to the limits of your capabilities at the time, and then you assess. And so, you know, I wholly expect the design that we use this year to be somewhat recognizable next year as well, but I also anticipate that we'll see iterations on this in order to improve this based on what the community needs and wants out of this process, because the point is to serve the community and to have the community sort of engage the process. So I see myself when I say as director, sort of like, I don't have any aspirations to like film direction. I'm not, but like director in that sense that there's a lot of moving parts, and my job is to make sure they all come in at the appropriate time. And then we fix things going forward as well. Oh, great, Leah. Thanks for pointing that out, that the chat log will also be there. I also have put my email on the screen. It's a little confusing because of the font that confuses L's and I's. So that's ljanicki@illinois.edu. I will also be at the upcoming ALA annual conference in New Orleans. If you happen to see me there, I'll be happy to chat with you. Or if you want to shoot me an email because you want to talk on the phone, be happy to set that up as well. So with that, I think we will bring this to a formal close. I will thank again Katina for her vision and leadership and creating space for this, Leah for her support and helping us see how we can make this happen within the Charleston Conference. And I look forward to all of you sending in your ideas and contributing, and hopefully we'll see a number of you at the Trend Lab in Charleston or at the Trend Talk panel. So thank you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to being part of this community and helping us work through this together.